Some promises are powerful enough to silence an entire kingdom, but only one made every soul inside the royal palace forget how to breathe. The massive doors of the royal library burst open just as the first rays of sunrise painted the towering stained-glass windows with warm shades of gold and crimson. Royal guards rushed inside with practiced discipline, followed closely by ministers, scholars, and servants who had gathered after hearing that their king had failed to appear for the morning council. No one expected what waited beyond the threshold. The room that usually echoed with quiet pages turning and measured footsteps had become completely still. Ancient shelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, countless leather-bound volumes standing like silent witnesses beneath drifting particles of light. At the center of the grand library, seated in an enormous carved wooden chair beside a long table covered with open books and unfinished reports, Alpha King Damian Brooks remained perfectly motionless. His posture carried the same commanding authority that had made neighboring kingdoms fear his name, yet something about the scene felt impossible. Resting peacefully against his chest was a young Omega wrapped in a simple cream-colored healer's robe. Ethan Hayes slept so soundly that he seemed completely unaware of the dozens of stunned eyes staring in disbelief. His breathing remained slow and steady, his expression calm, as though the entire palace had vanished and only quiet existed within the endless sea of books. The silence became almost unbearable. Every servant knew the stories surrounding Damian Brooks. For years, no one had dared approach the king unexpectedly. He rarely smiled. He trusted almost no one. His discipline had become legendary, and even the most respected nobles measured every word spoken in his presence. Seeing another person resting so naturally against him shattered every belief the palace had ever held. The captain of the royal guard took one careful step forward. His duty demanded action. The king had important matters waiting, and surely waking a common healer could not possibly offend the ruler of the kingdom. Another guard quietly reached out a cautious hand toward the sleeping Omega. Before a single finger came close, Damian's eyes opened. The room instantly grew colder, not because of magic or anger alone, but because every person present recognized the unmistakable gaze of a ruler whose decision could never be questioned. Without raising his voice at first, Damian slowly shifted his arm to shield Ethan from even the possibility of being disturbed. His expression remained calm, yet every movement carried absolute certainty. Then his voice broke the silence with terrifying clarity. "Wake the Omega sleeping on my chest, and you die." The words echoed through the towering library walls before disappearing into complete silence once again. No one moved. No one even remembered to breathe. The captain froze where he stood, his outstretched hand suspended in midair as realization spread across every face in the room. Ministers exchanged stunned glances. Servants lowered their eyes in confusion. Scholars who had spent decades studying history searched their memories for any story that resembled the impossible scene before them, yet none existed. How had the kingdom's coldest ruler become willing to protect a single Omega with such unwavering resolve? Why would the Alpha King, whose heart was said to be harder than marble, guard one quiet healer as though disturbing his sleep was the greatest offense imaginable? None of them knew the answer. None of them understood that the moment unfolding before their eyes had begun weeks earlier, when an exhausted king stood on the edge of collapse, and a healer unlike any the palace had ever known quietly walked through its gates, carrying nothing more than compassion, patience, and the power to change an entire kingdom without drawing a single sword. 3 weeks earlier, the royal palace had looked magnificent from the outside, but behind its marble walls, every corridor carried the weight of growing uncertainty. Alpha King Damian Brooks continued to rule with unwavering discipline, attending every council meeting, reviewing every report, and making every important decision without hesitation. To the people of the kingdom, nothing appeared unusual. The harvest remained strong, trade caravans crossed the borders safely, and neighboring rulers continued to respect the strength of the crown. Only those closest to Damian knew the truth. For nearly 4 years, the king had not experienced a single night of natural, uninterrupted sleep. He rested for minutes at a time before waking again, his mind refusing the peace that every human being needed. Royal physicians had exhausted every treatment known to the kingdom. Herbal remedies filled entire cabinets. Rarities arrived from distant lands. Musicians played calming melodies through endless evenings. Scholars searched forgotten medical texts preserved for centuries. Nothing changed. Damien thanked each person for their effort with quiet dignity. Yet every sunrise found him standing at the same library window while the rest of the palace slowly awakened. The lack of sleep never weakened his sense of responsibility, but it quietly stole pieces of his life. He no longer enjoyed conversations that once brought comfort. He rarely entered the palace gardens. Meals became shorter. Laughter disappeared completely. Even Captain Victor, the commander who had protected Damien since his earliest years as king, noticed subtle changes that no one else could see. There were moments when Damien paused in front of a familiar book, unable to remember why he had opened it. During council meetings, he occasionally stared toward the windows for several silent seconds before returning to the discussion as though nothing had happened. His decisions remained wise, but everyone feared how long even the strongest ruler could continue carrying such an impossible burden. One rainy afternoon, after another unsuccessful consultation with the royal physicians, an elderly historian quietly requested permission to speak. He was not a healer, nor did he claim to possess miraculous knowledge. Instead, he carried an old journal written decades earlier by a traveling scholar who had studied unusual forms of emotional healing throughout the kingdom. The historian carefully placed the worn journal upon Damien's desk and spoke with respectful honesty. He explained that some illnesses could not be reached through medicine alone because they were rooted in burdens carried silently for far too long. Among the many names recorded in the journal, one entry had recently drawn his attention. It described a young Omega healer from a quiet village whose methods relied not upon powerful remedies, but upon observation, patience, routine, and genuine understanding. The name written across the faded page was Ethan Hayes. Victor immediately expressed concern. Allowing an unknown healer into the royal palace seemed unnecessarily risky, especially when countless experienced physicians had already failed. Several advisors quietly agreed. Damien listened without interrupting. He studied the weather beyond the tall windows as rain traced slow paths across the glass. Finally, he closed the journal with measured calm. His voice remained steady, revealing neither hope nor disappointment. If every familiar road has reached its end, perhaps it is time to walk one that none of us expected. Within hours, a royal invitation bearing the king's seal began its journey toward a peaceful village far beyond the capital, carrying a request that would quietly change the lives of two men and eventually alter the future of an entire kingdom. 3 days later, the royal carriage returned through the eastern gates just before noon beneath a clear autumn sky. Unlike the decorated wagons that usually carried noble guests, this arrival drew attention because only one passenger stepped onto the stone courtyard. Ethan Hayes looked around the enormous palace with quiet curiosity rather than intimidation. His simple cream-colored healer robes contrasted sharply with the polished armor of the royal guards and the elegant clothing worn by ministers crossing the courtyard. He carried a small leather satchel filled with handwritten notes and carefully prepared herbs, but there was nothing extravagant about his appearance. Several servants exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected an elderly physician with decades of experience, not a calm young healer whose peaceful expression seemed entirely untouched by the overwhelming grandeur surrounding him. Captain Victor greeted Ethan with professional courtesy, although his guarded eyes revealed unmistakable skepticism. As they walked through endless marble hallways lined with towering columns, portraits of former rulers, and glittering chandeliers, Victor quietly explained the king's condition. He spoke of countless sleepless nights, failed treatments, respected physicians from distant kingdoms, and the growing concern shared by everyone inside the palace. Ethan listened without interrupting, asking only a few thoughtful questions instead of offering immediate solutions. He wanted to know what Damien enjoyed before the sleepless years began, where he spent most of his time, whether he preferred silence or conversation, and which room in the palace felt most comfortable to him. Victor found the questions unusual. No previous physician had asked about favorite places or daily routines. They had all focused on medicines, symptoms, and diagnoses. When Victor finally asked whether Ethan needed to examine the king immediately, the young healer answered with surprising calm. Not yet. Before I understand the illness, I must first understand the person carrying it. The words lingered in Victor's thoughts as they continued walking toward the royal library. Inside, Damian Brooks stood alone beside an enormous window overlooking the palace gardens. An open book rested upon the nearby table, although it was clear he had not turned a page for quite some time. Sunlight illuminated countless floating particles of dust, while rows of ancient books stretched endlessly behind him. Hearing footsteps, Damian turned with the composed expression expected of a king. Ethan respectfully bowed, but did not lower his eyes for longer than necessary. Instead, he met Damian's gaze with calm sincerity, neither intimidated by royal authority nor eager to impress it. For several quiet moments, neither man spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable rather than awkward. Damian had grown accustomed to visitors filling every pause with advice, reassurance, or promises. Ethan did none of those things. He simply observed. He noticed the untouched cup of tea growing cold upon the table, the carefully organized reports that showed remarkable discipline. Despite constant exhaustion, the slight hesitation before Damian shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and the instinctive glance toward the library shelves whenever conversation paused. Finally, Damian broke the silence. "You have not asked about my symptoms." Ethan offered the smallest smile before answering honestly. "Everyone else already has. I believe your symptoms have been carefully documented. I came here because I wanted to discover everything that those reports could never describe." Something almost imperceptible changed within Damian's expression. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. Yet for the first time in years, someone had spoken to him as a man carrying invisible burdens instead of a problem waiting to be solved. Neither of them realized that this quiet conversation inside the library had become the first step toward a bond that would eventually transform not only a sleepless king, but the entire palace that had long forgotten what genuine peace looked like. The following morning began with a routine unlike anything the palace had ever witnessed. Instead of preparing rare medicines or requesting expensive ingredients, Ethan Hayes simply asked that the royal library remain quiet for several hours each afternoon. The request puzzled nearly everyone. Several physicians privately questioned whether the young healer truly understood the seriousness of the king's condition. Others assumed he was delaying the inevitable failure that every expert before him had experienced. Captain Victor remained polite, but his confidence in the unusual treatment continued to fade with each passing day. Damian Brooks, however, offered no objections. Something about Ethan's calm certainty made refusing the request seem unnecessary. Each afternoon, after the final council meeting concluded, Damian walked into the library carrying only the documents that truly required his attention. Ethan would already be waiting beside the long wooden table with several carefully selected books gathered from different sections of the enormous collection. Sometimes they discussed history. Other days they explored philosophy, agriculture, architecture, or the journals of travelers who had crossed distant oceans. Ethan never hurried the conversations toward the subject of sleep. Instead, he encouraged Damian to speak about whatever captured his interest. For the first time in years, the king found himself discussing ideas instead of responsibilities. Hours passed without either man noticing. Occasionally, long moments of silence settled between them, yet those silences no longer felt heavy. They simply became another comfortable part of the afternoon. Outside the towering windows, autumn gradually transformed the palace gardens into brilliant shades of gold and crimson, while sunlight drifted slowly across endless rows of ancient books. Several days passed before Ethan made his first meaningful observation. He noticed that Damian always relaxed most while reading aloud from older travel journals, especially stories describing quiet forests, peaceful villages, and forgotten libraries untouched by politics or ambition. Whenever those passages filled the room, the king's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, and the constant tension behind his eyes softened. Ethan never interrupted those moments. Instead, he quietly turned the next page and allowed the rhythm of Damian's steady voice to continue. One afternoon, after nearly an hour of reading, Damian suddenly stopped speaking. Ethan looked up from his own book without surprise. The library remained completely silent except for the gentle rustling of leaves beyond the windows. Damian's head had slowly leaned back against the carved wooden chair. His breathing became deeper and more even than Ethan had ever seen before. For several seconds, the young healer remained perfectly still, understanding that even the smallest interruption might end the fragile moment. Nearly 15 minutes passed before Damien opened his eyes again. Confusion crossed his face at first, followed almost immediately by quiet disbelief. He glanced toward the tall clock standing beside one of the library shelves. The hands confirmed what he could scarcely accept. He had truly fallen asleep. Not for a fleeting moment measured in seconds, but long enough for time itself to feel different. Ethan smiled gently. Without celebration. Your mind finally believed it was somewhere safe, he said softly. Damien remained silent as he absorbed those words. He had expected complicated treatments, strict instructions, or unfamiliar medicines. Instead, the first genuine rest he had experienced in years had arrived inside a peaceful room, filled with books and calm conversation. News of the unexpected success spread carefully through the palace before sunset. Servants whispered in astonishment. Scholars smiled with cautious hope. Even the physicians admitted that something remarkable had happened. Captain Victor listened to every report with folded arms, still unconvinced that a single afternoon changed anything. Yet as evening settled over the palace, he noticed something impossible to ignore. For the first time in countless years, King Damien Brooks walked through the quiet corridors not as a ruler desperately forcing himself to endure another sleepless night, but as a man carrying the smallest, most unfamiliar feeling of hope. During the following weeks, the royal library quietly became the most important room in the entire kingdom. Every afternoon, once the formal responsibilities of governing had ended, Damien Brooks arrived carrying fewer reports than the day before. The towering shelves no longer felt like walls surrounding endless obligations. Instead, they gradually became a place where time moved at a gentler pace. Ethan Hayes never announced a treatment schedule or measured progress with complicated records. He simply continued the same patient routine that had already begun to restore something Damien believed had been lost forever. Some days they spent hours reading journals written by explorers who had crossed distant mountains and sailed unknown seas. On other afternoons, they discussed ordinary subjects that rarely appeared in royal conversations, including the changing colors of autumn leaves, the peaceful rhythm of village life, or the simple satisfaction of completing a favorite book. Damien found himself listening more than speaking, and to his own surprise, he enjoyed it. The constant pressure inside his thoughts slowly became quieter. His sleep improved. Little by little, never all at once, but enough for everyone closest to him to notice meaningful change. He began sleeping for nearly an hour on certain afternoons, then occasionally rested through part of the night without interruption. His appetite returned. The dark circles beneath his eyes gradually faded. Members of the morning council noticed that the king no longer paused in the middle of important discussions searching for forgotten thoughts. His attention became sharper, and the warmth that had once disappeared from his voice quietly returned. The palace itself seemed lighter. Servants smiled more often. Musicians once again played gentle melodies in the evenings. Even the royal gardens appeared brighter beneath the clear autumn sky. Yet not everyone welcomed the unexpected transformation without hesitation. Captain Victor continued watching every interaction between Damien and Ethan with careful attention. He respected the remarkable improvement, but years of protecting the king had taught him never to ignore uncertainty. One evening, after another peaceful session inside the library, Victor approached Ethan while the young healer organized several books before returning them to their shelves. He spoke honestly rather than harshly. He admitted that the palace had witnessed many false hopes over the years and asked why Ethan never accepted praise for the progress everyone now celebrated. Ethan paused before answering, gently placing the final book into its proper place. Because healing does not belong to the healer, he replied. The person who carries the burden chooses, little by little, to trust that peace is possible again. I only help create the space where that choice feels safe. Victor remained silent. The answer was unlike anything he had expected. There was no pride, no claim of extraordinary talent, and no attempt to impress the commander. As the days continued, even Victor noticed small details that challenged his lingering doubts. Damien laughed quietly during one discussion about an amusing story found in an old travel journal. The sound surprised everyone nearby because it had become so rare that several librarians instinctively looked toward the reading table. Another afternoon, the king closed an official report before sunset and suggested continuing it the following morning, something he had never done before. Ethan simply nodded, never reminding Damien that these moments represented remarkable progress. He treated every improvement as something natural rather than miraculous. Without realizing it, the two men had established an effortless routine built upon mutual respect instead of obligation. The library no longer served only as a place filled with books. It had quietly become a sanctuary where a weary ruler remembered how to breathe without carrying the entire kingdom upon his shoulders, and where a humble healer proved that genuine understanding could accomplish what countless remedies never could. Neither of them realized that one approaching rainy evening would transform that quiet friendship into the unforgettable moment the entire palace would witness together. Late one afternoon, dark clouds gathered above the capital, covering the palace in a steady curtain of rain that softened every sound beyond the towering library windows. The council meeting had ended earlier than expected because most of the kingdom's urgent matters had already been resolved. Damien Brooks carried only a single leather-bound journal into the library instead of the usual stack of official reports. Ethan Hayes was arranging several books upon the long wooden table when the king entered. Neither of them commented on the weather. They had long since grown comfortable with quiet beginnings. Rain tapped gently against the glass while fireplaces filled the enormous room with steady warmth. Ethan selected an old collection of travel memoirs describing peaceful coastal villages where fishermen measured time by the tides instead of royal schedules. Damien smiled faintly as Ethan began reading aloud, occasionally pausing to admire an unusual description or laugh softly at a humorous observation written decades earlier by an unknown traveler. The hours slipped away unnoticed as afternoon slowly faded toward evening. Outside, the rain continued without interruption, wrapping the palace in a peaceful silence unlike anything Damien had experienced in years. Eventually, Ethan closed the book and looked toward the nearest window. "Listen," he said quietly. Damien tilted his head. "To what?" Ethan smiled gently. "Exactly. There is nothing demanding your attention right now." The king remained silent as he listened more carefully. There were no urgent footsteps racing through the corridors. No anxious voices outside the doors. No messenger requesting immediate decisions. Only rain, distant thunder, the crackling fireplace, and the faint rustle of pages whenever a gentle breeze drifted through the room. Damien leaned back into the carved wooden chair and allowed himself to breathe more slowly. Ethan returned to reading another chapter in a calm, even voice that blended naturally with the rhythm of the rainfall. After some time, Ethan noticed Damien's eyes gradually closing. The familiar signs of peaceful rest appeared again, but this afternoon something felt different. The king did not simply drift into a brief nap. His entire posture relaxed in a way Ethan had never witnessed before. Without realizing it, Ethan continued reading for several more pages until his own voice became quieter. The long day, the comforting warmth, and the endless rhythm of falling rain slowly drew away his remaining energy as well. Looking for only a moment of rest before continuing, Ethan settled into the nearby chair. As sleep gently overtook him, his body unconsciously shifted closer while the library remained perfectly still. By simple chance rather than intention, his shoulder came to rest lightly against Damien's arm. Neither man stirred. Their breathing remained calm, and even as the storm continued outside, time passed unnoticed. Candles burned lower. The last traces of daylight disappeared beyond the rain-covered windows. Somewhere in the distance, a palace clock quietly announced another passing hour. Inside the library, however, there was only peace. It became the longest, uninterrupted sleep Damien had experienced in many years. No troubling thoughts interrupted him. No restless awakening pulled him back into exhaustion. Ethan also slept peacefully, completely unaware that the quiet position he had naturally settled into would soon become the center of an unforgettable moment. Beyond the library doors, Captain Victor noticed the unusually late hour and grew concerned that the king had not yet returned to his private chambers. Respecting Damien's routine, he waited several more minutes before gathering a small group of trusted guards. Believing the king might simply have become absorbed in his reading once again, Victor approached the great wooden doors with careful steps. None of them imagined that the peaceful scene waiting on the other side would forever change how the entire palace viewed both their king and the quiet healer who had restored far more than lost sleep. Captain Victor placed one hand upon the great wooden door before slowly pushing it open, expecting to find the king reading beneath the fading candlelight, as he had done countless evenings before. Instead, the entire group stopped at the threshold without speaking a single word. Rain continued falling beyond the tall windows while the library remained wrapped in peaceful silence. Damian Brooks sat in the large carved chair near the fireplace with his head resting comfortably against the high back. His breathing was slow, deep, and completely undisturbed. Resting gently against him was Ethan Hayes, who had unknowingly fallen asleep while sitting beside the king. His head had naturally settled against Damian's chest as both men remained peacefully asleep, completely unaware that anyone had entered the room. Victor instinctively lifted one hand, silently preventing the guards behind him from taking another step. No one dared whisper. After years of witnessing the king struggle through endless sleepless nights, the commander understood exactly what stood before him. This was not merely sleep. It was healing. One inexperienced guard quietly shifted his weight, causing a faint creak from the wooden floor. The tiny sound echoed through the silent library. Damian's eyes slowly opened. For a brief moment, he looked toward the doorway without moving, his mind still emerging from the deepest rest he had experienced in years. Then he glanced downward and realized Ethan was still peacefully asleep against him. Every person in the room waited, uncertain how the king would react. Damian carefully adjusted the blanket that had slipped from Ethan's shoulder without waking him. His voice remained low, calm, and completely steady as he looked directly at the gathered guards. "Wake the Omega sleeping on my chest, and you die." The words were not shouted. They carried no anger and no loss of control. They were spoken with the quiet certainty of a ruler whose decision required no further explanation. The library froze. Victor lowered his head in immediate understanding. He had protected Damian through wars, political crises, and years of relentless exhaustion. Yet he had never heard the king speak with such absolute conviction over another person's well-being. Without another word, Victor slowly motioned for every guard to step back. The heavy doors closed again with barely a sound, leaving the library undisturbed. Outside in the corridor, the young guards exchanged astonished glances but wisely kept their questions to themselves. Within hours, whispers spread through every corner of the palace. Servants who had never seen the king protect anyone so personally struggled to believe what they had heard. Ministers quietly repeated the remarkable story behind closed doors. Librarians smiled to themselves because they alone understood how many peaceful afternoons had quietly led to that unforgettable moment. Inside the library, however, none of those conversations mattered. Damian remained perfectly still, allowing Ethan to continue sleeping without interruption. He realized that for the first time in many years, he did not fear the coming night. He did not dread another battle against endless wakefulness. Instead, he simply appreciated the quiet peace filling the room. After several more minutes, Ethan stirred slightly before opening his eyes with obvious confusion. Realizing where he had unintentionally fallen asleep, he immediately sat upright with quiet embarrassment. "Your Majesty, I am so sorry. I did not mean to." Damian gently raised one hand, stopping the apology before it continued. A faint smile appeared, warmer than any expression Ethan had yet seen from him. "There is nothing to apologize for," Damian said softly. "You gave me something that no physician, scholar, or king has been able to find for years." Ethan looked into the king's rested eyes and noticed something extraordinary. The exhaustion that had defined Damian Brooks for so long was finally beginning to disappear, replaced by a calm strength that seemed ready to shape an entirely different future for them both. The morning after the unforgettable evening in the library, the atmosphere throughout the palace felt quietly different. No official announcement had been made, yet everyone sensed that something important had changed. Damian Brooks arrived at the morning council looking more rested than anyone could remember. His voice carried its familiar authority, but now it was accompanied by a calm warmth that had been absent for years. Ministers noticed that discussions flowed more naturally because the king no longer struggled against constant exhaustion. Decisions that once required visible effort now came with remarkable clarity. Even neighboring ambassadors commented that the ruler of the kingdom seemed renewed, though none of them understood the true reason behind the transformation. Ethan Hayes, meanwhile, continued his daily routine exactly as before. He requested no special recognition, accepted no luxurious accommodations, and politely declined every attempt to praise him as a miracle worker. Each afternoon, he returned to the library with another collection of books, another thoughtful conversation, and another opportunity for Damien to leave behind the invisible weight he had carried alone for so many years. Their friendship deepened through ordinary moments rather than dramatic declarations. They discussed childhood memories, favorite places, forgotten dreams, and the responsibilities that often prevented people from admitting they needed rest. Ethan never treated Damien like a distant king while inside the library. He treated him like a man who deserved peace as much as anyone else. Damien, in turn, found himself trusting Ethan with thoughts he had never shared with another person. One quiet afternoon, while sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, Damien admitted that he had once believed sleeplessness was simply the price every ruler eventually paid. Ethan gently shook his head. "Responsibility should never require someone to forget they are human," he replied. Those simple words stayed with Damien long after their conversation ended. Captain Victor also experienced his own quiet change of heart. He had spent weeks observing Ethan with careful suspicion, searching for hidden ambition or personal gain. Instead, he found only patience, humility, and genuine kindness. One evening, as Ethan prepared to leave the library, Victor stopped him near the doorway. The commander stood silently for a moment before offering a respectful bow that surprised the young healer. "I judged you before I understood you," Victor admitted. "Thank you for giving our king something none of us could." Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude. "You protected him for years," he answered. "I simply arrived when he was finally ready to rest." From that day forward, Victor no longer viewed Ethan as an outsider visiting the palace. He welcomed him as someone who had become essential to the kingdom's future. Weeks continued to pass, and Damien's recovery became impossible to deny. He slept naturally through most nights, enjoyed meals with members of the royal household, and even resumed evening walks through the palace gardens beneath the stars. The library remained their sanctuary, not because it possessed magical qualities, but because it had become a place where trust had replaced fear. One afternoon, as they quietly returned books to their proper shelves, Damien paused before one of the towering windows overlooking the gardens. Without taking his eyes from the peaceful view, he spoke with gentle certainty. "When you first arrived, I believed you came here to heal my sleep." Ethan looked at him curiously. Damien smiled, his expression carrying a peace that had once seemed impossible. "Now I understand that you taught me something much greater. You reminded me how to live while I was still awake." In that quiet moment, neither man realized their story had already become part of the kingdom's history, a story that future generations would remember not because of power or titles, but because genuine compassion had accomplished what strength alone never could. 5 years later, visitors traveling through the kingdom often spoke about its remarkable prosperity, but those who lived within its borders understood that the greatest transformation could not be measured by wealth or influence alone. The palace had become a place where wisdom was valued alongside strength, where quiet reflection carried the same importance as decisive leadership, and where people no longer believed that endless sacrifice was the only path to honor. King Damien Brooks had guided the kingdom through years of peace with the same courage that had once earned the respect of neighboring rulers, yet there was now a calm confidence in every decision he made. He listened more carefully, smiled more often, and never again allowed responsibility to convince him that he had to carry every burden alone. The royal library remained his favorite room in the palace. Although official business still filled many of its tables, one corner had been preserved exactly as it had been on the rainy evening that quietly changed everything. The familiar chairs still rested beside the fireplace, and the shelves continued to hold the same travel journals that had first helped a weary king rediscover peaceful sleep. Ethan Hayes chose to remain at the palace, not because of royal titles or personal recognition, but because he believed healing was never a task that truly ended. Under his guidance, a new center for learning welcomed healers from villages across the kingdom. Instead of teaching only medicines and remedies, Ethan encouraged them to understand patience, compassion, careful listening, and the quiet strength found in simple human connection. His lessons spread far beyond the palace walls, influencing an entire generation of healers who believed that kindness could be just as important as knowledge. Captain Victor often watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. Whenever young guards asked why the king valued the library so deeply, he simply smiled and answered that every kingdom possessed one place where its future truly began. He never revealed the full story immediately. Instead, he invited them to spend time reading, observing, and learning that not every great victory was won upon a battlefield. One crisp autumn afternoon, Damien and Ethan walked together through the palace gardens where brilliant leaves drifted gently across the stone pathways. They paused beside an old oak tree overlooking the distant hills beyond the capital. For several peaceful moments, neither man spoke. The silence between them had never required explanation. Finally, Damien glanced toward Ethan with quiet gratitude. "Do you remember the first day you entered the palace?" he asked. Ethan smiled warmly. "I remember wondering why a kingdom filled with so many people felt so lonely." Damien nodded thoughtfully before looking toward the horizon. "It is not lonely anymore." Ethan followed his gaze across the gardens where families, scholars, guards, and servants moved through the afternoon with relaxed smiles. The palace no longer carried the invisible weight that had once settled over every hallway. Peace had become part of everyday life. As evening approached, the bells of the capital echoed gently across the valley, welcoming another ordinary day in an extraordinary kingdom. Long after both men were gone, parents would tell their children about the wise king who once believed strength meant never resting, and about the humble healer who quietly proved that true courage sometimes begins with allowing yourself to be understood. They would also remember the words that had echoed through the palace on one unforgettable rainy evening, not as a threat born from anger, but as a promise born from gratitude, because everyone eventually realized that the moment a king chose to protect the person who had restored his peace was the same moment an entire kingdom discovered the true meaning of compassion, and that legacy endured far longer than any crown ever could.